I have been talking about colorism to a wide range of people for over a decade, and here are 6 common mistakes I see people making when trying to address this topic. One mistake that people often make is debating whether or not colorism still exists. This is a huge waste of time, constantly being on a hamster wheel of proving that this is even a problem prevents us from getting to the point of being able to solve the problem. And a lot of people who ask this question would never ask if racism were still a problem or if sexism were still a problem. And we can't think that problems just magically disappear. If you wonder if colorism is still an issue, ask yourself, what have been our concerted collective efforts to end colorism? A dirty room is not going to clean itself. So if you have not cleaned the room, you should not be surprised that the room is still dirty. And the same with colorism, because we have not really collectively as a society done enough to end colorism, it should come as no surprise to anyone that it is still plaguing our culture and our globe. Colorism has been a thing for centuries. It is still a thing, and colorism will continue to be a thing if we don't get to advance the conversation to talking about strategies and solutions to addressing it. A second really common and really unfortunate mistake that people make when addressing colorism is reducing it to a problem of individual low self-esteem. Now, some people who make this mistake simply have not been exposed to the research and the studies on systemic colorism and how it is a social problem that goes beyond an individual person's beliefs or feelings or attitudes about themselves. However, there are other people who want to reduce it to the issue of low self-esteem because they don't want to be implicated in the systemic nature of colorism. The moment you acknowledge that colorism is not just one person's problem about how they feel about themselves and that it is a cultural problem, a society-wide problem, then we are tasked with accountability and responsibility for stepping up to create social change. And a lot of people just aren't willing to do that work. And I'm not saying that self-esteem is not part of the equation or the overall picture of what colorism is. However, only acknowledging it as at the self-esteem level prevents us from getting to the root of the problem. So even if you acknowledge that colorism impacts self-esteem negatively, we have to understand why and how that impact happens. People aren't just born with low self-esteem. We have to look at the social, environmental factors that lead to that in the first place and really root out the problem from the source, not just put a band-aid on the effects of the problem. So again, if you wouldn't reduce racism or sexism to just a matter of people's individual self-esteem, please do not do that with colorism. Colorism involves systemic inequality and discrimination that goes beyond the individual. Individual people did not create colorism. We created colorism socially, societally, and so it's going to take that level of effort to mitigate or eradicate colorism. And this brings me to my third point. A big mistake that people make when addressing colorism is ignoring the research, ignoring the data, ignoring the facts, ignoring the historical legacy. This happened to me very recently. A so-called journalist admitted that she was not willing to change her position no matter what the facts or the research or the documentation said. And so a lot of people make this mistake, a huge mistake, in ignoring the data. And again, those same people would throw a fit if white people ignored research on racism or if men ignored research on sexism. And so you don't get a pass for doing that when it comes to colorism just because it's a lesser known issue, just because it's an issue people don't talk about as often. You don't have an excuse for ignoring real data, real research, real historical patterns on colorism. And in case you're wondering what some of that research is, it crosses every sector of society where healthcare, education, the justice system, sports, mental health, pay and education, I said education, but pay and wealth gaps, employment and hiring, all of these areas of society show that light-skinned people have an unfair advantage and have disproportionately better outcomes despite their actual effort, despite their qualifications, despite levels of education and resources. They are given the benefit of the doubt. And so even though the point of this video is not to outline all the research, I will link to a video here where I talk more in depth about some of this research, particularly in education and employment. A fourth mistake that is also really egregious but also extremely common is taking the all lives matter approach to colorism. And so a lot of people who want to engage in conversations around colorism are very clear, have the total logic argumentation for why all lives matter is not helpful when we're talking about the real racism and systemic violence that is inflicted upon Black people through no fault of their own. And yet we take the same approach when it comes to colorism. And so again, it's related to earlier points I made about ignoring the research and only wanting to talk about colorism through the lens or from the perspective of individual self-esteem. And so when we look at responses to colorism where people say all shades are beautiful, we have to love all Black people no matter our skin tones, or every Black person deserves to be seen and recognized and loved, all Black people matter. It's the same logic of ignoring the true inequalities, the true disparities that certain Black people have as a result of other systems of oppression like sexism, like colorism, ableism. Saying that all shades are beautiful completely ignores the fact that in our culture, in our society, only a certain selection of skin tones are perceived, are considered to be beautiful, while other skin tones on the darker end of that spectrum are systematically dehumanized, systematically devalued. And so we can't diminish the impact of that by simply making a blanket statement that all shades are beautiful. We know that technically, yes, all shades are beautiful. However, that statement and leaving it with that statement completely dismisses, ignores, and overlooks the true social impact and reality that certain skin tones have an unfair advantage. Certain skin tones are artificially propped up and positioned as more valuable and more beautiful than others. That's what we have to talk about when it comes to colorism. And again, we can make these same arguments when it comes to racism, which a lot of people have no problem understanding, but somehow they lose all sense of logic. Justice requires a redistribution of resources to make up for what has been denied certain groups that have been historically marginalized. And in this case, it is a redistribution of resources, efforts, and attention towards darker skinned people because they have been systematically denied those things throughout history and across multiple generations. This fifth mistake is one that is very common and it's also quite complex. So I might dedicate a full video to unpacking this further. But for now, I'll say that the fifth mistake a lot of people make is conflating colorism with mixed race issues. And so two things I want to point out here. One is that mixed race people come in a wide array of skin tones and hair textures and facial features. Mixed race people do not all look alike. They are not all light skinned. They do not all have loose curls or straight hair. And so even if you're only talking about mixed race people, you see that those with the lightest skin tones, those with the more European or white looking appearance have better outcomes. They are treated more favorably. They are perceived in society as being more professional, more approachable, etc. And that mixed race people who have darker skin tones or more Afro textured hair or broader, more indigenous features are devalued, even though they are also mixed race. And so that's one reason why we can't conflate, or we have to discern what is an issue of racial identity versus what is an issue of colorism specifically. But a second reason why we shouldn't conflate these issues is that a lot of times people approach the conversation of colorism by saying, well, I never felt Black enough, or I never felt Asian enough, and I wasn't white enough for that group, and I wasn't indigenous enough for that group, or I wasn't Hispanic enough for one side of my family, and I wasn't XYZ enough for the other side of my family. And while that can have something to do with your racial identity and the fact that you're mixed, being told that you're not Black enough or Asian enough can also happen to people who are monoracial. It can also happen to people who are dark-skinned. Because when we talk about fitting into a particular culture, the physical appearance is only one aspect of that. It can also be things related to your dialect, the way you speak, the music you listen to, how you dress, your interests and hobbies, your food ways, the kinds of food you eat, or your culture around mannerisms and forms of dance, etc., right? And so again, we can't oversimplify or flatten the meaning of that. And so while you might very well have felt that you didn't fit in with a particular side of your family or with a particular racial group, that is not what colorism is specifically, okay? And I want to be very clear about that. Colorism is not a conversation about not feeling like you're Black enough. Colorism, the meaning of colorism, the definition of colorism is the devaluation, the discrimination, the disregard, the dehumanization, the prejudice, the biases against people with darker skin tones. And that is irrespective of how they identify ethnically or racially, okay? There is overlap, there is intersectionality for sure, but we cannot co-opt the conversation around colorism, which brings me to the sixth point. One very common and again tragic mistake of how people try to talk about colorism is by centering the opinions and the feelings of light-skinned people, the people who are most privileged in the dynamic of colorism. And so privileging, or centering rather, the experiences, feelings, opinions, and perspectives of the privileged people only perpetuates for further harm. It only perpetuates the very system that we're talking about. And you have to ask yourself why you feel so moved and so compelled to center or prioritize or to coddle and to see after the comfort of light-skinned people in these conversations. It likely has to do with your own colorist biases. So because people come to the conversation of colorism not having unpacked or checked their colorism, their internalized colorism, they are the ones who are most likely to defer to the opinions, perspectives, feelings, and experiences of light-skinned people in these conversations. And I, as a dark-skinned Black woman, have frequently observed how even when we're talking about colorism, I am experiencing colorism, right? People at the table are actively perpetuating colorism in the conversation of colorism. And so deferring to and centering light-skinned people is an example of how you perpetuate that harm, even when you're trying to address the issue. So let me know in the comments if you have seen any of these mistakes being made when people try to have conversations about colorism, and how do you address them or point them out. Hope to see you in the next video. Take care.